We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
Nobody likes to be misunderstood, especially not artists. Those who choose to paint or write or make music or perform in front of an audience usually do so out of a desire to express something about themselves and the way they see the world. Even artists whose work may seem obscure or confusing are usually hoping to connect with a specific, discerning audience. Anton Chekhov is one of the most revered and influential playwrights in the history of the theater. According to numerous surveys of theater professionals, he ranks second only to William Shakespeare in his contribution to the Western theater. Chekhov built his reputation by communicating things that may seem simple on the surface, but when you look deeper prove to be profound revelations about the human condition. People feel that when they read or see a Chekhov play, they are seeing an expression of something that lives in their own heart. But Chekhov's ascendancy was not a straightforward or untroubled path. Born in 1860 in Taganrog, Russia, where his parents, a former serf and a Ukrainian immigrant, ran a grocery store, Chekhov first embarked on a career in medicine, writing short stories as a diversion. He would continue to practice medicine throughout his life. Chekhov wrote to a friend once that medicine was his lawful wife and literature his mistress, though he made little money as a physician and would often treat his poor patients free of charge. In 1887, after his short stories had achieved some acclaim, Chekhov was commissioned by a theater manager to write his first full-length play. The script he produced, Ivanov, which he wrote in 2 weeks, an experience that he described as sickening, remains Chekhov's least produced drama. But it was nonetheless the beginning of a legendary career and one of the most important, albeit small, bodies of work in the history of the theater. The way people appreciate Chekhov is very different from the way they appreciate Shakespeare. Compared to Shakespeare, Chekhov's plays are simple, spare. They usually take place in one location. They lack the Byzantine plot structure and the hordes of townspeople and spear carriers on stage. There are no epic battles like in Henry IV Part 1 or the kind of extended comic set piece that you get in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Chekhov's plays mostly feature characters talking to each other. Just talking. Trying to reach across the aching emotional gulf that separates people and to express, often obliquely, the depth of their frustration and longing. His plays, in other words, don't hit you in the head. They hit you in the heart. Henrik Ibsen, who worked around the same time as Chekhov, is often credited as the father of the modern realistic drama, depicting scenes of domestic strife with a psychological acuity that most of his predecessors and contemporaries lacked. A lot of people would say that Chekhov accomplished something similar, though he focused on a different facet of the human experience than Ibsen. Less interested in diagnosing and depicting the psychological and social woes of his characters, Chekhov was a cartographer of the human heart, bringing a kind of emotional verisimilitude to the stage that audiences had never seen. But it was a difficult process. Although he was already a prize-winning fiction writer by the time he began writing for the stage, Chekhov's first 2 full-length plays, Ivanov and The Wood Demon, were commercial and critical failures. He only hit his stride with the composition of his 3rd play, the now legendary 4-act drama, The Seagull. But even then, when he had written a script he was happy with, a script he was sure was actually good, and it had been picked up by a major theater in St. Petersburg, it was still not smooth sailing. Chekhov traveled to St. Petersburg for the opening night of his latest effort, confident that it would be his first major hit. The performance was such an abysmal failure that he left the audience after the 2nd act and spent the rest of the play slinking around backstage. The lead actress was so disturbed by the audience's jeering that she lost her voice. It was a catastrophe. Chekhov left St. Petersburg the next day, skipping the rest of the run. He was dismayed by the experience, even writing to a friend that it was enough to make him never want to write another play again. But it doesn't seem to have been the play's failure that so galled the playwright. Indeed, one of Chekhov's colleagues in the theater wrote to him to explain that the rest of the run had been a resounding success. The opening night performance seemed to have been an anomaly. This did little to assuage Chekhov's consternation. He continued to rail against the production, saying the director had no feeling for the mood of his work, and the actors roundly misunderstood the dialogue and their characters. And that last bit, that gives us some insight into what was really on Chekhov's mind. You see, Chekhov wasn't upset that his play had failed, at least not primarily. He was upset that it had been misinterpreted. I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode we take a look at a different topic in the arts, examining what it means to us and how it shapes our perceptions of the world. Today I'm talking about the various ways that works of art can be misinterpreted, and what the consequences of these misinterpretations may be. And I want to start by returning to the Russian theater at the end of the 19th century. Chekhov would continue to have a chip on his shoulder about the way his plays were produced throughout his career, notably through a string of unqualified successes with the Moscow Art Theater under the careful direction of Konstantin Stanislavski, someone who also knew a little something about emotional truth. If you're not familiar with Stanislavski, he was a seminal director and acting teacher who basically laid the groundwork for the kind of honest, deeply felt, fully embodied performances that we today almost take for granted on stage and screen. Actors like Marlon Brando, Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, Denzel Washington, we can trace their methods straight back to Stanislavski. You can't watch a movie or a stage production today without seeing his fingerprints. But the two men could not see eye to eye on Chekhov's scripts. There's a possibly apocryphal story about Stanislavski reading passages of the Seagull to his acting company at the Moscow Art Theater and proudly reporting to Chekhov that there had not been a dry eye in the room. Chekhov, the story goes, responded with the terse message, "My dear Konstantin, the play is a comedy." Whether or not this exact exchange occurred, there is no doubt that the two men saw Chekhov's plays quite differently. Some of this might have owed to their very different backgrounds. Chekhov was a humble country doctor who never had any wealth to speak of. Stanislavski was a member of one of the richest families in Russia, an amateur actor, and otherwise unemployed until the age of 33. He was able to indulge his decades-long exploration of dramatic effects in large part because of the leisure afforded him by his family's enormous wealth. So it's no wonder that where Chekhov would see a biting satire of the idle aristocracy in a play like his Cherry Orchard, Stanislavski would see a heart-rending drama about a family confronting the unwelcome cultural and economic changes befalling their country. Chekhov took issue with just about everything about Stanislavski's direction, from the overwrought staging to his meticulous musical scoring and what he saw as the turgid pace of the dialogue as Stanislavski had his actors perform it. Chekhov would hang about in rehearsal, often taking actors aside to give them notes that directly contradicted the instruction they'd received from Stanislavski. And all along, the playwright remained perplexed and peeved that everyone seemed to be having such a hard time understanding his plays as he'd intended them. He didn't think it was that hard to get. Once, when approached by an actor for insight into his character, Chekhov replied, "I don't really know. You should perform it as it's supposed to be done." Now that is some serious shade. Theater is an art form that depends on collaboration and interpretation in its very making. You simply cannot get a play up on stage without the input and the individual perspectives of the actors, the designers, and of course, the director and the producers. So before the members of the audience get to interpret the work for themselves, it's already been interpreted, perhaps inconsistently, by the many members of the team working on the production. And this is one of the things that makes the theater vital. You can see 5 different productions of The Seagull, and you're never seeing exactly the same play, The actors will have different qualities, they'll make different choices, the motifs and tones set by the designers may give the thing a whole different feel, and the rhythm and sweep of the story might have a different shape and tenor. Chekhov didn't much care for this aspect of the theater. He once went so far as to admit that there are different interpretations, but he quickly followed this up with the prickly assertion that the author has the right to demand that his play is performed and the parts played wholly according to his own interpretation. And that is a quote. In other words, you may choose any interpretation you wish, provided that it is mine. The thing is, for all these accusations that other people were misinterpreting his work, Chekhov may not have understood how his own plays were best served. Stanislavski was not alone, even in Moscow, in stressing the play's tragic elements. Many critics and fellow theater artists agreed. If Chekhov had been granted the prerogative to set the tone of his productions, his plays might have been written off as odd little unfunny comedies. They might never have risen to the prominence that they have. It may be that what we continue to perceive in Chekhov's plays is not so much what he wrote into them, but what Stanislavski coaxed out of them. Nonetheless, Chekhov remained convinced that his work was largely misunderstood until the tuberculosis that had haunted him since his 20s finally claimed his life at the age of 44. If theater is particularly susceptible to deviations in interpretation by dint of the fact that so many people have their hands on the work before it reaches the public, it is by no means alone. When we regard any work of art, we almost necessarily engage in an act of interpretation. It's impossible not to see it, read it, or hear it in a certain way, if only subconsciously. And with the inevitability of interpretation comes the possibility of misinterpretation. The most obvious and common kind of misinterpretation happens when the audience misunderstands the artist's intended meaning or effect. This happens across all mediums, from Georgia O'Keeffe's insistence that she really was just painting flowers, to Peter, Paul, and Mary's impatience with the idea that Puff the Magic Dragon has anything to do with psychotropic substances.
It's a great song.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
Who would have thought it wasn't really about a dragon, huh?
What do you mean?
You know, the whole drug thing?
No, I don't know. Why don't you tell me?
Some people think that to puff the magic dragon means they're really to smoke marijuana cigarette.
Puff's just the name of the boy's magical dragon.
Right.
Are you a pothead, Fokker?
No. What? No, Jack. No, I'm not. I pass on grass all the time.
Nor do we need to have an explanation from the artists themselves about their intention to make a valid claim that an interpretation is bogus. Many misreadings of Shakespeare in phrases like two star-crossed lovers and wherefore art thou Romeo owe to a clear misunderstanding of common usage in 16th century English. In the latter case, you have to know that wherefore means why, not where, or you'll make nonsense of the line, as many young actresses do. There are a bunch of entertaining and occasionally insightful top 10 lists of oft misinterpreted literature that you can find on various blogs and YouTube feeds. Among the most cited cases are the Shakespeare lines I mentioned, along with a pair of verses from the poems of Robert Frost, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, I took the one less traveled, and that has made all the difference," and "Good fences make good neighbors," both of which are dripping with irony and cynicism when read in context. And then there are certain lines from Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. More on that later in the episode. You can also find some trenchant observations about the novel Fahrenheit 451, which the author Ray Bradbury himself said was not really about censorship per se. It was more about the dangerous dumbing down of the populace as the active process of reading is replaced by the passive process of watching television. But perhaps no work in the history of literature, secular literature at least, has been as widely misunderstood, in my mind, as the harrowing tale of harassment and emotional mayhem starring a Loki-like trickster who goes by the deceptively unassuming appellation, Sam I Am.
That Sam I am, that Sam I am. I do not like that Sam I am.
Green Eggs and Ham was written and illustrated by a man named Theodore Geisel, working under the frankly quite creepy pen name Dr. Seuss. Since its publication in 1960, the book has sold millions of copies, becoming one of the best-selling children's books in history. We have a copy of it in my home, on a shelf in my son's room, a fact which may shock and disturb you once I've opened your eyes to what's really going on in this story. The story itself is pretty simple. The character Sam I Am, a youthful, puckish creature of unknown provenance, passes by the unnamed central character who declares his dislike for Sam I Am. Sam I Am responds by asking if the character likes green eggs and ham. The character says he doesn't. Sam I Am persists. Eventually, the main character relents just to get Sam I Am to leave him alone, and when he tries the unlikely dish, he discovers that he likes it. He then thanks Sam I Am for opening his eyes. What makes the story work so well is the set of formal innovations that Geisel introduces. A fairly short list of phrases snowballs as Sam I Am offers various new conditions in which the unnamed central character might enjoy the dish he is offering. Each time, the character repeats the growing list back to him, rejecting every permutation, a conceit that is turned on its head in the end when he declares, "I would eat them in a box, and I would eat them with a fox," an ostensibly happy ending in which the main character has learned a valuable lesson about trying new things, and, in the process, made a new friend and reconciled himself with his community. An elaborate set piece about trying new foods, right? What could be wrong with that? Not so fast. Let's take a closer look at what actually goes down in this little book. Our unnamed main character is sitting by himself, quietly reading his newspaper, not bothering anybody, when this little guy passes by, rather ostentatiously and distractingly riding on the back of a small creature, holding up a sign that reads, "I am Sam." He then passes by again, showing the other side of the sign, which reads, "Sam I Am." Now think about this. The guy has a sign that he displays to all the world, broadcasting his identity not one, but two ways. And he wears a proud, smug smile as he's doing it. Sam I Am presents from the beginning with unmistakable symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. Grandiosity, an arrogant demeanor, a sense of entitlement, a heightened self-perception, and an inability to empathize with others' feelings, needs, or wishes, in this case, the main character's desire to be left alone. Now, the main character's response to Sam I Am's intercession is unfortunate, declaring that he doesn't like that Sam I Am. He's a bit crotchety, and we can accept that as a character flaw. We can. But Sam I Am cannot, further demonstrating his lack of empathy. Sam I Am further intrudes upon the man's peace and privacy with the odd question about whether the character likes green eggs and ham. Now, at this point, it would probably be best for the main character to point out that the food shows obvious signs of being spoiled, so it's not really a matter of liking it or not liking it, it's a matter of safety and hygiene. Unfortunately, he doesn't do this, choosing to rebuff Sam I Am and saying that he does not like green eggs and ham. True to his deviant personality, Sam I Am cannot accept this simple rejection. Instead, he offers a series of inscrutable scenarios in which the man might eat the meal. In a box, with a fox, on a house, with a mouse. But he gives no explanation why these superficial changes in the surrounding or his dining companion should alter the fundamental fact of whether or not he enjoys the food. Nor does Sam have any apparent knowledge whether the character has even tried green eggs and ham in the past. If someone came up to me and offered me some tripe soup, I would be mighty irked if they persisted after I had turned down the offer. I have, unfortunately, tried tripe soup. I didn't know what I was ordering. It was awful. But persist Sam does, his pursuit of the main character growing increasingly reckless and irrational, taking the chase onto a speeding car and a train that is barely able to stay on the tracks, threatening not only his own safety and the safety of his victim, but the lives of innocent passengers as well. All in service of his demented obsession with the gustatory preferences of a man who just wanted to be left alone to read his paper. In the end, the main character is so exhausted from the chase that he relents, beaten down by Sam's bullying, and the reader is left to wonder if, rather than actually liking green eggs and ham, he is brainwashed into thinking he does by the abuse he has suffered, along with the social pressure of the people and animals looking on as he takes a bite. And, by the way, he affirms that he likes green eggs and ham before he has actually tried the ham, a sign that he may not be of sound mind at this point in the course of the events. The basic pattern of the character's conversion is familiar from other works of Geisel's, notably How the Grinch Stole Christmas. The two stories showcase the author's pathological aversion to outsiders and preference for an unquestioning, dumbly smiling conformity. A preference that is somewhat surprising when we regard the formal ingenuity of Geisel's work. He was one of the great originals of 20th century letters, which leads me to wonder if we can take the apparent message of his books at face value, or whether, like Niccolo Machiavelli writing The Prince, there is an esoteric meaning that runs counter to the surface message. Perhaps the book is a dark warning to those who would see its insidious undercurrents. Do not so easily conform to what the flock would have you do or have you be. Resist. I don't know what Geisel's true intention was, but it's hard for me to read Green Eggs and Ham without a slight frisson of dread. Now, I recognize that I occupy the minority position on this matter, and that my reinterpretation of this classic story might itself be flawed. But let's assume for a moment that I'm right, as I like to do. The question then is, does it matter? Let's say I actually believe Green Eggs and Ham to be a disturbing tale of harassment, reckless endangerment, and brainwashing. Should I stop reading it to my 2-year-old son, lest he think that Sam I Am's totally excessive and irresponsible behavior is in any way acceptable? Should I ban this book from our house, or give it the Fahrenheit 451 treatment and eliminate it altogether? In short, no. I don't think I should. I'm not really afraid of any literature. Not that I'm planning to read passages from Last Exit to Brooklyn to my son anytime soon, but I don't really buy the idea that a book's lesson or message might be a corrupting influence. Because I don't think that's the way we read fiction, even kids. I don't think we read stories to receive prepackaged lessons, at least not so bluntly. Even in parables and fables, at least the good ones, which I consider many of Dr. Seuss's stories to be, the real goods are in the negotiation of the challenges and conflicts the characters face, rather than in the pat conclusion. We take in all of the elements of a good story and break it down, process it, till it into the soil of our own character. We don't just listen to the moral. We don't extract the distilled lesson and spit out the husk. Case in point, there's an alternate telling of the Little Red Riding Hood story floating around online that demonstrates how flat-footed stories become when an author tries to make it all about the lesson. On the website barbwire.com, a contributor named Dr. Mark Creech, I'm not sure what he's a doctor of, gives his own version of the fairy tale. It begins with the story, that we all know, but at the end, after the woodcutter has killed the wolf, there's a twist. These 5 foolish judges step in and accuse the huntsman of having been prejudiced and bigoted and intolerant, and they said that he had no right to defend the grandmother of Little Red Riding Hood. And then a bunch of other people and animals get behind the judges and start an advocacy group. The thing was posted in 2015. It's very obviously a commentary on the Supreme Court ruling regarding same-sex marriage. But as if that weren't clear enough from just a cursory reading of the story, the author adds a little afterword, and I'm just going to read this whole thing in its entirety, because it's pretty amazing. Dr. Creech writes, "I would not do all the work for the reader here, but if it helps. In this fable of Little Red Riding Hood, the grandmother is traditional marriage. The wolf is homosexual activism, Little Red Riding Hood is an unsuspecting public, and in another way, children and their future. The basket of assorted goodies signifies the many blessings and joys of real marriage. The woodcutter is true religion's opposition to so-called gay rights. His axe is state constitutional amendments to define marriage as one man and one woman. The 5 foolish judges are the U.S. Supreme Court justices who ruled to redefine marriage for the nation. The clever foxes are professionals who argue homosexuality is inherent, fixed, unalterable, and normal. The townspeople represent ever-changing public opinion. Now that you have the key, perhaps you should read it again." No, Dr. Creech, I don't think that'll be necessary. I think we get the point just fine. This is, in fact, a story that would be virtually impossible to misinterpret. It's easy enough for confusion to arise accidentally around a work of art, for context to be left out, or for people to simply misinterpret things they read, hear, or see. But what about when the mistakes are not so innocent? How should we take it when a person, an influential public figure even, deliberately distorts the meaning of a work of art? In 1984, President Ronald Reagan was ready to coast through his re-election campaign right back into the White House. He had won easily 4 years earlier, defeating the incumbent Jimmy Carter by historic margins. All signs pointed to the '84 campaign being even more of a cakewalk. Although Reagan's approval ratings had suffered in the wake of the economic recession of the early '80s, he was rebounding in the public eye, and his message of American pride and patriotism continued to resonate with broad swaths of the public. Along with this, he was facing a pretty weak opponent in Walter Mondale. Nonetheless, Reagan's team wasn't taking any chances. They had begun to make an effective strategy out of seizing ideas, sounds, and images that seemed patriotic and spinning them into their message. That year, they were given an unlikely gift in the form of a blistering new album from rock and roll singer Bruce Springsteen. The album was called Born in the USA. The cover featured the singer's athletically proportioned rear standing in front of an oversized American flag. It just looked great. Campaigning in Hamilton, New Jersey, a short drive from Springsteen's hometown of Long Branch, Reagan told the audience,
"America's future rests in 1,000 dreams inside your hearts. It rests in the message of hope in songs of a man so many young Americans admire, New Jersey's own Bruce Springsteen."
He played the title track from Springsteen's new album at this and other events until Springsteen himself caught wind of what they were doing and asked them to stop. You see, Born in the USA is not a patriotic song, at least not in the gauzy, unquestioning, love-of-country way that Reagan was exploiting. It's a story about a young man from a poor town who, faced with few options, gets in legal troubles and ends up being sent off to serve in Vietnam, or, as the lyrics put it more bluntly, to go and kill the yellow man. When he returns home, he can't find work, and the employees at the VA offer no help. The last verse ends with the line, "Nowhere to run, ain't got nowhere to go." In view of this, the hook line, "I was born in the USA," appears as a bit of caustic irony. This man is not proud to be an American, as Lee Greenwood unabashedly sings in another song released the same year, and also used by the Reagan campaign. Rather, as Springsteen himself puts it, the working-class man featured in his song is facing a spiritual crisis in which man is left lost. It's like he has nothing left to tie him into society anymore. He's isolated from the government, isolated from his job, isolated from his family, to the point where nothing makes sense. I imagine Springsteen's character ending up in a very bad place, perhaps out on the street joining the ranks of the homeless Vietnam veterans we've all seen too many of. But there's an upshot to this episode that Reagan and his team may not have foreseen, though even if they had, I'm not sure how much they would have cared. As Mark Dolan points out in an article published in Politico on the 30th anniversary of Born in the USA's release, the confrontation with the Reagan campaign forced Springsteen to become more overtly political, articulating for the first time in public the progressive undercurrent that had long run through his lyrics. In a 2005 interview on NPR, Springsteen spoke about the 1984 campaign, saying, "This was when the Republicans first mastered the art of co-opting anything and everything that seemed fundamentally American. And if you were on the other side, you were somehow unpatriotic." You see, Bruce Springsteen did see himself as patriotic, though in a very different way than Reagan and his cohorts. And now he was asked to articulate that. "There is a real patriotism underneath the best of my music," he tells us, "but it is a critical, questioning, and often angry patriotism." Springsteen's conflict with the president clarified and energized his commitment to making his country better, more fair, and more just. In the 3+ decades since Reagan willfully misinterpreted his work, Springsteen has become more and more politically charged, making his views known and brutally rebuffing leaders who might blithely assume him to be one of their own, notably when he refused to appear on stage with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, an embarrassing slight from the governor's hero. Early in 2017, during an appearance in Australia, the singer told the crowd that he was embarrassed to be an American. And here we see an affinity between Springsteen and Chekhov. For both artists, the misinterpretation of their work, whether real or imagined, accidental or deliberate, benign or malicious, forced them to look more closely at what they had created and how it might be perceived. It jostled them out of their complacency. And to that extent, it may have done them and the work, and us, some good. We must allow for the reality that the author cannot ultimately dictate how their work will be received, read, and interpreted. I think it's a good idea for a reader to take a nod from the author's intent if that intent is known. But at the end of the day, it is the prerogative of the reader to make of it what they will. That's one of the things that makes novels and poems worth reading, plays worth watching, songs worth hearing, that we can wrestle with them, look at them from different angles, and disagree with our friends about what they really mean. It would be an impoverished literature, indeed, that could be read in only one way. That ceases to be literature, in fact, and becomes propaganda. The Nazi Party appropriated a hideously distorted version of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy into their propaganda, a fact that is bitterly ironic, since Nietzsche himself had written contemptuously of German nationalists and anti-Semites. When something like that happens, when a fascist regime turns a philosopher's expression of spiritual ascendance into a justification for genocide, or when a Supreme Court justice quotes Robert Frost saying, "Good fences make good neighbors," in a way that suggests it is the poet's honest sentiment, as Antonin Scalia once did in a ruling. Or when a presidential candidate co-opts a lyric whose true meaning is anathema to everything that candidate stands for. This not only debases the art by transforming it into propaganda, it does so with an Orwellian perversity. And when we're served a dish like that, I think the appropriate response is definitely to say, "I will not eat it in a box. I will not eat it with a fox. I will not eat it in a house. I will not eat it with a mouse. I will not eat it here or there. I will not eat it anywhere. This episode of Quite Useless was produced by me and my brother Mike, who created the music you heard. You can find us on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts, regardless of what platform you use. If you could go onto iTunes and drop us a review or a rating, we would really appreciate that. Our website is www.thisisquiteuseless.com, and you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. If you have a question or comment, a story idea, or if I have in some way offended you, by all means shoot us an email. That's quiteuselesspodcast@gmail.com. This is Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join us for more Quite Useless endeavors.